In year 2000, the death of a bright 17-year-old girl named Simone Bishop was officially ruled a suicide. The case was a simple, tragic, and heartbreakingly common story of teenage despair. With no signs of foul play, the police closed the file, leaving her mother, Eleanor, to drown in a silent, suffocating sea of grief. For months, the girl's bedroom remained a sealed, perfect sanctuary of memory, a room her mother could not bring herself to touch. But when Eleanor Bishop finally found the strength to confront her daughter's ghost and began the agonizing ritual of cleaning the room, she found something hidden behind a mirror. It was a small, secret video camera. The final tape it contained was not a suicide note, but a chilling, defiant recording that shattered the official narrative and proved her daughter's death was not a suicide, but a murder. The discovery transformed a grieving mother into a relentless detective and exposed a monster who had been hiding in plain sight, a killer whose perfect crime was undone by the one witness he never knew existed. Before I begin, thank you for watching. I'd love to know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It means a lot to know you're here, sharing these stories with me. We're in this together. The police told one story. A mother's love found another. Now, let me tell you what really happened to Simone Bishop. The final report lay on the polished wood of Eleanor Bishop's dining room table, a thin, sterile manila folder that felt heavier than a tombstone. Detective Robert Perry sat opposite her, his large frame looking uncomfortable in the delicate antique chair. He was a man in his 50s, his face a kind, weary roadmap of his years on the force, and his eyes held a look of genuine, professional sympathy that did nothing to soften the brutal finality of his words. Standing just behind her, a hand resting on her shoulder in a gesture of silent, shared grief, was her husband, Robert. His face was a mask of stoic, hollowed-out sorrow. "Mrs. Bishop," Detective Perry said, his voice a low, gentle rumble, "the medical examiner's report is conclusive. The cause of death was acute toxicity from an overdose of her prescribed antidepressant medication. We found the empty bottle by her bed. The levels in her system were significant." He slid the report across the table. Eleanor stared at it. The clinical, black and white text, a blur through the thick, distorting lens of her tears. She had read it a dozen times already. Lividity, consistent with time of death. No signs of struggle. No defensive wounds. Door locked from the inside. Every sentence was a nail in the coffin of the daughter she had known. The scene was secure, Detective Perry continued softly, as if reciting a catechism of tragedy. There was no forced entry. We found a journal. Some of her recent entries indicated she was feeling a great deal of pressure. The stress of college applications, of her final year. Eleanor knew the journal he meant. It was filled with her daughter's poetry, with her anxieties, with the normal, tumultuous, beautiful chaos of a 17-year-old girl's mind. A mind that the police had now interpreted as a suicide note, based on the totality of the evidence, Perry concluded, his official duty forcing him to speak the unspeakable. "We are closing the case. The official ruling is death by suicide." The word hung in the silent, sun-drenched dining room, a word so monstrous, so fundamentally wrong, that it seemed to suck all the air from the space. Suicide. It was a story, a neat, tidy narrative that explained the unexplainable. It was a box that allowed the police department to close a file, to move on to the next tragedy. But it was a story that did not include her daughter, not the Simone she knew. Simone, her vibrant, funny, fiercely intelligent daughter, her budding filmmaker, her artist, her poet. Yes, she was moody. Yes, she felt the world with a painful, adolescent intensity. She had been seeing a therapist, had been prescribed medication for anxiety. But she was not a girl who would surrender. She was a fighter. She was a girl who was in the middle of a dozen projects, her mind a whirlwind of ideas and plans. She had just been accepted to NYU's film school, her dream, a dream she had worked for with a singular, passionate focus. The girl in Detective Perry's report was a stranger, a ghost of clinical depression who had taken her daughter's place. Robert's hand tightened on her shoulder, a gesture of shared, unbearable pain. Eleanor simply nodded at the detective, too numb, too hollowed out by the past month of grief to argue. She thanked him for his work. She walked him to the door. She closed it. And then she was alone with her husband in the quiet, perfect house. With the official, state-sanctioned lie resting on their dining room table. The investigation was over. The world had its story. And her own, private and far more terrible investigation was just beginning. The weeks that followed were a season in hell. Eleanor and Robert Bishop, a couple who had built a life on a foundation of shared dreams and quiet intellectual partnership, were now two strangers adrift in the same silent sea of grief. The house, once a place of warmth and the happy, chaotic energy of a teenager's life, was now a silent, suffocating tomb. Eleanor, a woman who had built her life on the comforting order of lesson plans and the elegant logic of Shakespearean sonnets, now lived in a world without structure, without meaning. She was a high school English teacher on an indefinite leave of absence, a mother without a child, a wife whose husband seemed to be a million miles away. Grief was a physical presence, a heavy, invisible cloak that she could not take off. It slowed her movements, clouded her thoughts, and stole the taste from her food. She and Robert moved through the silent, empty rooms of their house like ghosts. Their conversations a series of clipped, functional exchanges that never touched the vast, screaming emptiness between them. Eleanor attributed his distance to his own unique way of grieving. He was a man of quiet, stoic control, a successful businessman who had always compartmentalized his emotions. She saw his grief in the new, deep lines around his eyes, in the way he would stare into the middle distance for long, silent minutes, his jaw tight. She told herself they were two people on separate, parallel tracks of the same terrible journey. But a small, disloyal part of her mind, a part she tried to silence, was unsettled by the nature of his sorrow. It felt hollow. It was a perfect, almost theatrical performance of a grieving father. He was stoic. He was supportive. But there was a strange, brittle quality to his sadness, a lack of the raw, messy, and unpredictable chaos of her own grief. She dismissed the feeling as a symptom of her own trauma, a projection of her own shattered state. The epicenter of their shared, silent grief was Simone's bedroom. It was on the second floor, at the end of the hall, and its door had remained closed since the day the police had unsealed it. It was a sanctuary, a time capsule, a crime scene. Neither of them could bring themselves to open it. To cross that threshold would be to admit a finality that they were not yet ready to face. It was the one place in the world where their daughter was still, in a way, alive, her presence lingering in the scent of her perfume on a pillow, in the clothes still piled on a chair, in the posters of her favorite filmmakers, Spike Lee, Quentin Tarantino, Agnes Varda, still tacked to the walls. Eleanor's days were a form of suspended animation. She would wake late, the morning sun a cruel, cheerful intrusion. She would wander the silent, empty rooms of her house, her hand trailing along the walls, as if trying to relearn the geography of a life that was no longer hers. She would sit for hours in the living room, staring at the photographs on the mantelpiece. Simone as a gap-toothed 7-year-old. Simone at her middle school graduation, her academic robes too big for her. Simone on her 17th birthday, just a few months ago, her face luminous with a future that would never happen. Her mind was a torture chamber of unanswered questions. The police report, with its neat clinical certainty, was a constant, mocking presence. Suicide. The word was a poison. She would lie awake at night, her mind a frantic, desperate prosecutor, cross-examining the last weeks of her daughter's life. Had she missed a sign? A cry for help? Had their last argument, a stupid, trivial disagreement about a curfew, been the final straw? The guilt was a living, breathing creature, a parasite that fed on her grief. But beneath the guilt, beneath the sorrow, was a harder, colder, and more resilient emotion: doubt. It was the one thing that kept her from completely succumbing to the darkness. Her daughter, the girl she had raised, the girl whose every mood and nuance she had known, was not the girl in that report. The story did not fit. It was a story that had been imposed upon her. A convenient narrative that had erased the vibrant, complex, and ultimately unknowable truth of her child. She did not know what that truth was. She only knew, with the unshakable primal certainty of a mother, that the official story was a lie. And she knew that if she was ever to find her way back to the world of the living, she would have to find the strength to confront the one place where the truth might still be hiding. Her daughter's room. The day she finally decided to open the door was a gray, drizzly Tuesday in late November, 2 months after Simone's death. The decision was not a conscious one. She had simply woken up that morning with a sense of quiet, cold resolve. The waiting was over. It was time. Robert had already left for work, a silent gray ghost slipping out of the house before the sun was fully up. She was alone. She walked up the stairs, her heart a slow, heavy drum in her chest. She stood before the closed white door, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She took a deep, shuddering breath, a prayer for a strength she did not feel, and she turned the knob. The room was as the police had left it. The bed was unmade, the sheets a tangled landscape of her daughter's last, troubled sleep. A stack of books on film theory sat on the nightstand. A half-finished drawing was tacked to a corkboard on the wall. The air was still and thick with the faint, sweet scent of her daughter's perfume. It was a place of unbearable, heartbreaking normalcy. Eleanor stood in the doorway for a long time, a visitor in a life that was now a museum. Then, with a slow, deliberate purpose, she stepped inside. She had not come to mourn. She had come to search. She did not know what she was looking for. A letter? A hidden diary? A clue that the police, with their professional, male eyes, might have missed. She was a mother, and she was on a final, desperate mission to find her daughter. She began with the clothes, the first and most painful of tasks. She opened the closet, a cascade of color and fabric, and began the slow, agonizing process of sorting, of folding, of deciding what to keep, what to give away. Each garment was a memory. The worn, soft flannel shirt Simone had loved to wear on rainy days. The black, elegant dress she had worn to the prom, a night of such hope and excitement. Eleanor worked with a kind of numb, methodical efficiency, her movements a shield against the wave of grief that threatened to pull her under. She spent the entire day in that room, a slow, archaeological dig through the layers of a life cut short. She sifted through drawers of poetry, of half-finished screenplays, of ticket stubs from movies they had seen together. She found nothing, no note, no hidden secret, only the beautiful, messy, and tragically incomplete archive of a 17-year-old girl's life. As evening approached, she was down to the last, final task, cleaning the room itself. She armed herself with a bottle of polish and a soft cloth, the familiar domestic ritual, a small, comforting anchor in the storm of her emotions. She dusted the bookshelves. She wiped down the windowsills. And then, she turned to the large, full-length mirror that was attached to the closet door. She sprayed the polish onto the glass and began to wipe it down in long, circular motions. As she did, she noticed that the mirror was slightly loose, that it rattled in its frame. It had always been that way, a minor, forgotten item on a long list of household repairs. She pressed on the corner to steady it, and it shifted, swinging slightly away from the door, and in the gap, she saw it. A small, dark, and unnatural shape. It was a shelf, a small, custom-built wooden shelf, cleverly hidden behind the mirror's frame. And on the shelf, pointed directly out through a tiny, almost invisible hole in the mirror's silver backing, was the lens of a small, compact Sony height camcorder. Eleanor stared at it, her heart stopping in her chest. a hidden camera. Her daughter, the budding filmmaker, had turned her own bedroom mirror into a secret two-way eye. A cold electric shock went through her, a feeling that was part terror, part a sudden, brilliant, and terrifying hope. The police had searched this room for a clue, but they had never thought to look behind the glass. Eleanor's hands trembled as she reached behind the mirror and carefully lifted the small, heavy camcorder from its hidden perch. It felt like a sacred object, a relic from a lost world. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions. Why had Simone set this up? What was she trying to record? Was this a part of some student film project? Or was it something else? Something more sinister? She found the camera's bag in the back of the closet. Inside were a dozen height tapes, all neatly labeled in Simone's familiar, artistic script. Most were clearly school projects, documentary on urban decay, film noir lighting study. But one tape, the one that was still inside the camera, was labeled with only a single stark word: evidence. A cold dread, sharper and more terrifying than any grief she had yet felt, washed over her. This was not a school project. This was a record. This was a testament. She took the tape, her fingers fumbling with the small plastic cassette, and walked out of the silent, waiting bedroom. She went downstairs to the living room, to the television and the VCR, the tools of a life that had, in the space of a single, shocking discovery, been irrevocably changed. She was no longer just a grieving mother. She was now the sole keeper of her daughter's final, and most important, film. She slid the tape into the VCR. The machine whirred, clicked, and then the screen, which had been a blank, blue void, flickered to life. The image was of Simone's room, seen from the strange, static, and slightly elevated perspective of the mirror. The quality was grainy, the colors muted, but the scene was clear. And it was not a suicide note. It was a confrontation. The recording began with Simone, sitting on her bed, her face a mask of tear-streaked anguish. The bedroom door opened, and her father, Robert Bishop, walked in. He moved with a heavy, weary tread, his face etched with a deep, troubled sadness. He sat on the bed beside his daughter. "We can't keep doing this, Simone," he said, his voice a low, pleading rumble. "You have to let this go. You have to. Let it go?" Simone's voice was a raw, broken whisper, but it was laced with a steel that Eleanor had never heard before. "How can I let it go? I know what you did, Daddy. I saw the papers, the accounts. The money is gone. All of it. You stole it from your own company. You're going to lose everything. We're going to lose everything." Robert's face, which had been a mask of sorrow, hardened. The sadness was replaced by a flash of cold, desperate anger. "You don't understand," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing hiss. "I did it for us. For this family. To give you and your mother the life you deserved. This isn't a life. It's a lie," Simone cried, her voice rising. "You have to tell her. You have to go to the police. You have to make it right." "There is no making it right," Robert said, his voice flat and final. "There is only keeping it quiet." And then, the final, chilling moment. Simone, in a gesture of desperate, pleading defiance, looked directly at the mirror, directly at the hidden lens. "I can't let you do this," she said, her voice now strong, clear, and filled with a terrible, heartbreaking courage. "I have the proof. I will not let you destroy this family." Robert's eyes followed her gaze. He looked at the mirror, and in his eyes, Eleanor saw a flicker of dawning, horrified recognition. He saw the tiny, dark pinprick of the lens. He understood what she had done. He lunged, his hand reaching out, not for his daughter, but for the mirror, for the camera, for the one silent witness to his secret. The image on the screen became a blur of motion, and then the tape cut to a violent, screaming wall of static. Eleanor sat in the darkness of her living room, the silence of the house a crushing, deafening roar. The tape was a bombshell. It was a motive. It was a confession. It was a testament to her daughter's incredible and ultimately fatal courage. The official story, the story of a sad, lonely girl who had taken her own life, was a lie. Her daughter had not been a victim of depression. She had been a warrior, a young filmmaker who had used her own secret camera to document the monster in her life. And that monster was her own father. The grief that had consumed Eleanor for months was burned away in an instant, replaced by a new and terrifyingly powerful emotion. A cold, clear, and absolute certainty. Eleanor Bishop was now a detective, and she was living in the same house as the prime suspect in her daughter's murder. The tape was her only lead, and she became its most obsessive, dedicated scholar. She watched it not once, not twice, but dozens of times. Her living room transformed into a makeshift cold case unit, the glow of the television screen, a constant, ghostly presence in the silent house. The man she had shared a bed with for 25 years, the man she was now sharing a hollow, grief-stricken existence with, was a stranger, a monster. Her every interaction with him was now a performance, a terrifying act of concealment as she tried to maintain a facade of the grieving, broken wife, while her mind was a whirlwind of fear, rage, and cold, analytical calculation. She did not go to the police, not yet. She knew, with a deep, cynical certainty, that they would be skeptical. They would see a grieving mother, clinging to a wild, unsubstantiated theory, accusing her own, equally grieving husband. They would see an ambiguous recording, a heated family argument, a tragic but explainable suicide. She knew she needed more. She needed a piece of hard, irrefutable evidence, a fact that could not be dismissed as the fantasy of a parent in denial. She needed to find the one, small, overlooked detail that would corroborate the story the tape was telling. The detail that would prove not just a confrontation, but a murder. Her approach was that of a literary critic, a profession she had honed over 30 years. She began to deconstruct the recording, to analyze it not for its emotional content, but for its data. She created a timeline, a transcript, a list of every object, every word, every shadow. She was searching for the one, small detail that would break the case open, the detail that would transform her from a crazy, grieving woman into a credible, undeniable witness. She cross-referenced the tape with Simone's diaries, her school papers, her computer files. She was building a case, brick by brick, in the quiet solitude of her own home, a home that had become a prison. She learned that the papers Simone had mentioned were likely from a locked file cabinet in Robert's home office, a place Simone, a curious and intelligent girl, had likely managed to break into. The motive was clear. Simone had discovered her father's financial crimes and had confronted him, and he had killed her to silence her. But this was still not enough. It was a motive, but it was not proof of murder. The proof, she was certain, was on the tape itself. She just had to be smart enough to see it. The moment of discovery, when it came, was a quiet, almost anticlimactic click of a puzzle piece falling into place. She was watching the tape for what must have been the 50th time. She was focused on the final, chaotic frames, the blur of motion as Robert lunged towards the camera. She played the sequence in slow motion, frame by agonizing frame, and in the blur, for a fraction of a second, his left arm was in clear view. His shirt sleeve had ridden up his wrist, and on his wrist was his watch. It was his signature watch, a heavy, gold Rolex, a gift she had given him for their 20th anniversary. It was unmistakable. Eleanor froze, the remote control slipping from her fingers. She felt a surge of pure, ice-cold adrenaline. She scrambled to her feet and ran to her study, to the locked drawer where she kept the one official document she had from the police. She pulled out the thick, final report on Simone's death. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the transcripts of the original interviews. and she found it. Detective Perry's interview with her husband, Robert Bishop, conducted the day after Simone's body was found. Perry had asked Robert for his alibi, for his whereabouts on the afternoon of their daughter's death. And Robert's answer was right there, in cold, black and white type. "I was running errands all afternoon," the transcript read. "I had to drop my watch off at the jeweler's for a repair." "It's been there all week. You can check." Eleanor stared at the words. "It's been there all week." The videotape was irrefutable, time-stamped proof that he had been wearing the watch during his confrontation with Simone. His alibi was not just a mistake. It was a deliberate, calculated, and now provable lie. She had it. She had the proof. She had the one, single, undeniable fact that would force the world to see the truth. She had the weapon that would, she now knew, finally bring her daughter's killer to justice. The meeting with Detective Robert Perry took place in the same sterile interview room where he had, months earlier, gently but firmly, closed the case on her daughter's life. This time, the dynamic was different. Eleanor Bishop was not there as a grieving mother. She was there as an investigator, and she had brought her evidence. Perry, to his credit, had agreed to the meeting, though his demeanor was one of weary professional indulgence. He saw a woman who was still trapped in the denial stage of grief. A woman who needed to be handled with a gentle, therapeutic touch. He was prepared to listen patiently, and then to gently, regretfully, tell her that it changed nothing. "Mrs. Bishop," he began, his voice soft, "I know this is difficult, but we have to trust the evidence." E's report was very clear. The ME's report was based on a false timeline, Detective, Eleanor said, her voice a calm, clear, and unwavering line. She opened her bag and placed a single, unlabeled height videotape on the metal table between them. "My daughter was a filmmaker. She was working on a project. I believe you need to see her final film." Perry sighed, a deep, tired sound. He had seen this before. Grieving families, desperate for answers, would create elaborate, imagined narratives. But he was a decent man. He would watch the tape. He would listen. He took the tape and slid it into the VCR, TV combo unit that was bolted to a metal cart in the corner of the room. He hit play. The grainy image of Simone's bedroom appeared on the screen. Perry watched, his expression impassive, as the scene with Robert Bishop unfolded. He saw the heated emotional argument. He saw a family in crisis. He saw a deeply troubled father and a distraught, defiant daughter. "This is a tragedy, Mrs. Bishop," he said when the tape ended. "And it's clear your family was under a great deal of stress. But it's not proof of murder. It's a family argument." "You're right," Eleanor said. "That's not the proof. The proof is in the final frames." She took the remote, rewound the tape to the last chaotic seconds, and played it in slow motion. She stood up and walked to the screen, her finger pointing to the blurry, but unmistakable, image of the gold watch on Robert's wrist. "His watch, Detective. He's wearing his watch." Perry squinted at the screen. "Okay," he said, his voice cautious. "He's wearing his watch. So what?" "So," Eleanor said, her voice a quiet, deadly weapon, "his official sworn statement to you, the alibi he gave you for the afternoon of our daughter's death, was that he was running errands, the most important of which was dropping this very watch off at the jeweler's for a repair. He claimed the watch had been at the jeweler's all week. This tape proves he was lying." A flicker of something confusion, irritation, a dawning, uncomfortable understanding crossed Perry's face. He remembered the alibi. It had been a minor, but solid detail. He looked back at the screen, and then at Eleanor, and in that moment, he finally, truly, saw her. He saw not a grieving, hysterical mother, but a sharp, intelligent, and incredibly determined woman who had just presented him with a fundamental and deeply troubling contradiction. His entire case had been built on the assumption of a suicide. But a man with a false alibi was not the father of a suicide victim. He was a suspect. The The reopening of the Simone Bishop case was a quiet, momentous event within the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. It was a professional embarrassment, a case that had been closed and was now being pried back open by the dogged, methodical work of the victim's own mother. For Detective Robert Perry, it was a moment of profound and deeply uncomfortable self-reflection. He had not been a bad cop. He had simply been a cop who had followed the most obvious, logical path. A path that had been a carefully constructed lie. Now, with a new and deeply personal sense of purpose, he began to deconstruct his own flawed investigation. His first and most critical act was to verify Eleanor's claim. He made a single quiet phone call to the high-end jewelry store where Robert Bishop was a regular customer. He spoke to the owner, a man he knew. He asked him to pull the repair records for Robert Bishop for the previous year. The jeweler called back an hour later. The records were clear. Robert Bishop had indeed dropped off his gold Rolex for a routine service. But the date on the intake form was not a week before Simone's death. It was the morning of the day she died. And the pickup receipt was signed and dated for the following afternoon. Robert's alibi was not just broken, it was shattered. He had lied, deliberately and provably, about his whereabouts on the day his daughter had died. A stunned Perry realized that Eleanor's impossible, monstrous story was true. He was now investigating a homicide, and the prime and only suspect was the victim's own father. The case was no longer a cold file. It was a live and very active investigation into a man who had, until this moment, been the picture of a grieving, sympathetic victim. The POV shifts to Perry, a man who now sees the entire case in a new, sinister light. He sits in his cluttered office late at night, the videotape playing on a small monitor, the ghostly images of Simone and her father, a constant, looping reminder of his own failure. He is no longer looking at the case as a suicide. He is looking at it as a staged homicide. The new theory of the crime begins to form, a narrative built on the foundation of Eleanor's discovery. Simone Bishop, a smart, observant, and courageous girl, had discovered that her father, the successful businessman, was a criminal. She had found evidence of his massive, multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme. She had, as the tape showed, confronted him. She had not been threatening him. She had been pleading with him, begging him to confess, to make it right, to save their family from the ruin that was coming. And Robert Bishop, a man whose entire identity was built on the facade of success and control, had been backed into a corner. Faced with the loss of his company, his wealth, his reputation, and the prospect of a long prison sentence, he had panicked. And in that moment of panicked, narcissistic rage, he had killed his own daughter to silence her. The method was as cowardly as it was clever. He had known about her struggles with anxiety, about her prescription medication. He had used her own vulnerability as his weapon. Perry's theory was that he had forced her to ingest a massive, lethal overdose of her own antidepressants. He had then carefully staged the scene to look like a suicide. He had placed the empty bottle by her bed. He had likely even forged the final despairing entries in her journal, a cruel, final act of character assassination. He had locked the door from the inside, knowing how to bypass the simple lock to relock it from the outside. He had created a perfect, seamless crime scene, a narrative that the police would be predisposed to believe. He had then gone to the jeweler, picked up his watch, and created a false, but easily verifiable alibi for the following day, knowing that the time of death would be a crucial, and in his mind, controllable, element of the investigation. His one critical mistake was the camera. In his panicked, arrogant belief that he had committed the perfect crime, he had not known that his daughter, the filmmaker, had been recording their final, fatal conversation. He had not known that his own signature gold watch would become the star witness against him. Perry now had a theory, a motive, and a broken alibi. He was on the verge of an arrest, but he knew that a defense attorney would tear the case apart, painting Eleanor as an unstable, grieving mother and the tape as an ambiguous family argument. He needed one, final, irrefutable piece of evidence. He needed to prove the motive. He needed to find the financial crime that had led to the murder. The second search of the investigation was not a search of a house, but of a life. Armed with the evidence from the videotape and the broken alibi from the jeweler's records, Detective Perry was able to convince a judge to grant a sealed, comprehensive warrant for the financial records of Robert Bishop and his company. It was an unprecedented move, a deep, intrusive dive into the life of a man who was, to the public, still a grieving father. The task of sifting through a decade of complex financial data was handed over to the police department's forensic accounting unit. The lead accountant, a quiet, methodical woman who was a legend in the department for her ability to make numbers confess, began her work. The investigation into Robert Bishop's finances was a slow, painstaking excavation of a secret life. On the surface, his company was a model of success, a thriving construction firm with a portfolio of impressive projects. His personal finances were equally pristine, the picture of a wealthy, responsible family man. But the forensic accountant was not interested in the surface. She began to dig deeper into the complex web of subcontractors, suppliers, and shell corporations that are the lifeblood of any large construction business. And there, she found the rot. It was a classic and brilliantly executed embezzlement scheme. Robert had been systematically defrauding his own company for years. He had created a series of phantom subcontractors, shell corporations that existed only on paper. He would then generate fraudulent invoices from these ghost companies for materials that were never delivered, for labor that was never performed. He would approve the payments himself, funneling millions of dollars from his own company into a series of hidden offshore bank accounts. The fraud was massive, sophisticated, and had been going on for nearly a decade. But the accountant's report revealed something more pressing, a fact that provided the direct, immediate trigger for the murder. In the weeks leading up to Simone's death, Robert's company had been subjected to a routine but mandatory external audit by the IRS. The auditors were closing in. They had flagged a series of suspicious transactions and had scheduled a final in-person meeting to review the original invoices. That meeting was scheduled for the day after Simone was killed. The truth was now brutally, chillingly clear. Simone had not been the only one who had discovered his crimes. The IRS was on his trail. He was on the verge of being exposed, of losing everything. His daughter's confrontation had not been the beginning of his crisis. It had been the final, personal, and unbearable complication in a world that was already collapsing around him. He had not just been trying to silence his daughter. He had been trying to buy himself time, to find a way to hide the evidence from the federal investigators who were about to walk through his door. The financial audit was the final, irrefutable piece of the puzzle. It was the motive, written in the cold, hard language of a ledger. It transformed the case from a compelling but circumstantial one into an ironclad prosecution. The numbers, which Robert Bishop had so skillfully manipulated to build his secret fraudulent empire, were now the very things that would bring it all crashing down. The final confrontation took place in the same sterile interview room where the investigation had been reborn. Robert Bishop sat across from Detective Perry, his face a mask of calm, weary indignation. He had come to the station voluntarily, at Perry's request, still playing the part of the cooperative, grieving father. Perry did not begin with the finances. He began with the heart. He played the videotape, forcing Robert to watch the final, terrible confrontation with his own daughter, to hear her desperate, pleading voice one last time. Robert watched, his face impassive, a single, crocodile tear tracing a path down his cheek. "It was a terrible argument," he whispered, his voice thick with a feigned emotion. "I was trying to help her. She was so confused." Perry stopped the tape. He then laid the first piece of hard evidence on the table. It was the jeweler's repair receipt, with its damning timeline. "Your alibi was a lie, Robert," Perry said, his voice a low, even monotone. He then laid down the second document. It was a single summary page from the forensic accountant's report. a flowchart that showed the movement of millions of dollars into a hidden offshore account. And finally, he laid down the third piece of paper. It was a copy of the email from the IRS, confirming their scheduled audit for the day after Simone had died. She knew, Perry said quietly. And the IRS was about to know. You ran out of time, and you ran out of choices. Robert Bishop stared at the three pieces of paper, a perfect, logical, and irrefutable narrative of his crime. The calm, confident facade he had maintained for months, for years, finally, and completely disintegrated. The successful businessman, the grieving father, the meticulous killer, vanished, leaving behind only a small, pathetic, and defeated man. He slumped in his chair, and in a low, broken whisper, he confessed. He told them everything. The argument, the flash of rage, the desperate, panicked act of forcing the pills down his own daughter's throat, the cold, methodical staging of the scene, the construction of the alibi. The story ends with Eleanor Bishop, a few weeks later, in her quiet, empty house. The trial is over. Robert has been sentenced to life in prison. She is holding the Hiite tape in her hand, the tape labeled evidence. She has watched it one last time. She is no longer filled with just grief or with rage. She is filled with a fierce, profound, and heartbreaking pride. Her daughter, the brilliant, brave 17-year-old filmmaker, had seen the truth, and in her final and most important act, she had found a way to make sure the world saw it too.